Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to paint a creepy cute dragon with complementary colors. A full list of materials is in the description. Let's start with the lightest colors, first with the yellow and then with the orange color. In order to make this painting stand out, I want as much color variation as possible in every single segment. So to achieve this, I'm first wetting the area that I'm going to paint, and then I drop in the watercolor around all the edges of the single segment. I let the watercolor bleed towards the center, leaving the center white. I can help the watercolor move, and sometimes I use my brush as a sponge to soak up some of the water, and other times I just drop in some clear water to enlarge the white area in the center, because the water will push the watercolor pigment aside. This will result in really cool cauliflowers and a really large color variation within each segment. If you like the look of a painting where the colors blend into each other, you can totally just continue to paint, but I would like to keep the orange and yellow separate, so I just give it a few minutes to dry. While it's drying, I'm mixing some cadmium yellow with orange to get a really shiny light color. Just the orange by itself would be too dark and it would not really match the painting. The orange watercolor mix is applied to the paper with the same method. I wetten the segment first and then I drop in the watercolor around all the edges, letting it bleed towards the center. In order to paint the smaller areas, I'm using a smaller brush because it just makes it easier for me to know that there cannot be a lot of water in the brush in the first place. Let's move on to paint in the wings and then the belly of this dragon. The color variations will look really cool and make the whole painting look interesting. This is why you can always drop in some water in the end, just to make it more interesting and create these really cool blooms. Masking fluid can make your life so much easier when you want to paint in the eyes. I'm using a small wooden stick to apply some masking fluid in the white spaces within the eye to preserve them. Watercolor cannot run under it, and when the watercolor is dry, I can just peel it off and all the white spaces will be preserved. You will see later that I'm going to change my mind on some areas, some of the white shine within the eye, because I thought it just looked more expressive if I do not have this white glare lines on the eye. So do whatever makes you happy, and if you're not happy with the white spaces you preserved, you can always fix them after. Lifting color, on the other hand, after you already applied it to the paper, that's a whole different thing and that can be tricky. So do not rely on being able to lift color. But you can also use gouache, which is basically an acrylic paint, and apply to your dry painting to create some white areas. Dioxazine purple is one of my favorite colors, so I'm going to paint in the body of the dragon with the purple color. For the whole painting, I selected two contradicting colors, which are on opposite sides of the color wheel to really make it pop. The orange and the purple accent each other and make each other appear even more intense to the eye when they are placed next to each other. The head of the dragon is a bit larger than the other segments that I painted in earlier, so I will be working in sections here. I wetten all the head first and then I drop in some watercolor. When some of the wetted areas are already dry, by the time I get around to them, I just re-wetten them. There is no need to be afraid of cauliflowers or blooms, because that's what we want. We want this painting to be interesting. This is why I end up by dropping in some more intense pigment and some water drops just to create some movement and just to create a really cool pattern. On the other hand, I do not want any puddles to form, so I can just soak them up with my brush, which I dried off and use as a sponge, or I just use a piece of tissue just to dry off some of the puddles. It is easier for the eye to recognize the different parts of the painting if the colors are slightly different and not very uniform. So I'm mixing in some ultramarine to the purple in order to give it this really cool color variation, and it's not a lot of ultramarine in there, so it will just be enough to make it easier for the eye to see the color difference. Ultramarine is a granulating color, therefore it will settle differently on the paper. It will look really cool and just very unique. And once again, I will be adding drops of water into the drying pigment, as well as drops of watercolor. I'm even dropping in some of the ultramarine blue just to make it more interesting. And of course, I'm also coloring in the other parts of the body that are connected to the areas that have the ultramarine mixed into it. I'm also mixing the ultramarine into those areas just to make it visible to the eye that they are connected. Here it actually is a good idea to make sure that the orange is already dry, because if those two colors mix, it would just look messy in the final painting. Let's add some more water droplets in the drying paint to create more blooms. For the tail, I'm going back to using the Dioxazine purple only. Since I did not wash out my brush properly, it is definitely possible that there is some ultramarine left in the brush, which is not a big deal. The legs should not be bleeding into the tail, as they already had a few minutes to dry while I colored in the rest of the body. For this part, I'm making sure to have more pigment in my brush to make the color more intense and darker overall. Let's do the wings next. If you're afraid that you might touch wet paint with your brush or your hand, you can always give it a couple minutes to dry in between each section. I weten the wing, and then I'm using a smallish brush to apply some of the purple color to the paper. I let the watercolor bleed, and I help the watercolor to bleed with a wet brush. And I can always drop in more water or even more color. As you can see here, sometimes the paper just soaks up the water so fast that you cannot get to it before it's already dry. Not a big deal. I will go in with a wet brush after and reactivate some of the watercolor that I just dropped down on the paper. I'm allowing the watercolor to bleed into the area that I just freshly wetted, softening all the edges. Just don't wait too long to go in with the wet brush and the water, because the pigment might already have started to form hard edges, which can be hard to remove at times, or even hard to catch in the act. For the body of the dragon, I chose to use Dioxazine purple again, but this time I'm mixing in some purple lake, which is basically a pinkish color. It just gives it a really cool color variation and makes a really nice warm color. I did not properly mix the colors on my palette, so that I do have some color variations on the paper as well, because the colors aren't properly mixed in my brush either. I'm using the same method like before. I pre-wetten the paper in order to give myself more time to work on it, and then I drop in a lot of watercolor on all of the edges, letting it bleed towards the center. You can help the color to move with your brush and drop in some more pigment after, and even some water droplets, just to cause some really cool blooms on the body. And remember, watercolor dries light, so it will be lighter once it's dry than it is right now when you see it in a wet stage on the paper. Let's use that color mix again on the feet. I'm leaving out some of the paw pad areas, like on the heel, and of course I'm leaving out all the toes. Reusing the color here that I used for the body will tie the whole painting together. I could have used masking fluid for the white patch on the feet, but to be honest, it's not a bother to paint around it, so why make it more complicated? Those eyes need to be really bright and shiny in order to make the whole painting pop a little more. So I'm dropping down some water in the eye, and then I drop in some of the light blue color that I selected in advance. I did play around with using orange for the eyes before, but to be honest, the whole dragon just looked plain evil. Once the watercolor starts drying, I'm dropping in some water in the center of the eye, letting it push the pigment outwards. This will give the eye a really cool look and a really large color variation. The horns can be used to tie the painting together as well. First, I color it in with the yellow color that I used earlier for the wings, and then I drop in some of the orange color that I also used earlier, giving it this really cool color variation and color gradient. Reusing those two colors will tie the whole painting together. Planning colors in advance and sticking to the plan makes painting really easy. Especially the yellow and orange mix looks beautiful on this painting. I'm also using those colors for the nails, on the feet and the hands. Instead of introducing a new color like black, I just mix a really intense purple color for the very center of the eye. It will be dark enough, and since it's still a purple tone, it will just tie in with the painting perfectly. Once everything is completely dry, I can just use my finger to remove the masking fluid from the eye. And sometimes it is necessary to do small corrections with a small brush and some of those colors. In this case, the blue did not come out as straight in some areas as I wished it did, so I'm just straightening out some of the edges. I chose to add some details to the painting. I'm outlining the toenails just to make them pop a little more. This is really unnecessary, but I just like the way it looks. Sometimes it's those small details that make a painting look complete. So the eyes were dry and I really did not like the shine I added with the masking fluid. So I take a damp brush and I just rub over the watercolor just to loosen some of the pigment and redisperse it around the eye. Since the blue part of the eye is somewhat wet, I can go in with some of the blue color again and let the blue color bleed towards the center of the eye from the outside where I just added. Just keep an eye on it while it dries so that you can mop up any unwanted bleeds with your brush immediately. The purple color in the head area looked a little pale compared to the rest of the body, so I decided to intensify it in some areas. I can add some water first and then the purple pigment and let it bleed, or I can add the purple pigment and then use a damp brush to wetten the area around where I just added the line and let the watercolor bleed in that direction naturally. It is also a really good way to straighten out some edges or intensify the colors in some areas. The white and the yellow and orange areas will pop way more when I add an intense dark purple color right next to them, so this is where I intensify my colors. I'm adding an intense dark purple next to the orange and yellow parts of the ear to make the orange pop even more, and also the purple will look even stronger. Time for some finishing touches. Ultramarine blue was already used in the painting before, so I'm using that to add some dots to the knee of the dragon and to the head of the dragon, and to the elbow as well. It's just a little neat accent, and it repeats a color that I already used before. The details in the face are added with Dioxazine purple, but I did not water down this pigment a lot. I'm using it basically pure. And this is a really nice way to get a dark color, which is not black and therefore does not contradict the rest of the painting. It just ties in more naturally if I repeat the same colors that I used before and do not introduce a new color. All of those details are still visible under the previous layer of watercolor. I added them to my original line drawing to make sure that I know where they are at this point in the painting process. Especially facial features can be really hard to paint without a line drawing, or without your pencil lines that shine through the watercolor. The easiest way to paint those small details really is with a small brush. Yes, you will have to refill it quite often, but you will be in full control over how much water is in your brush and how much watercolor is released. And there we have it. I hope you enjoyed painting with me today. Please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you soon with another video.